Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event on the immigration trilemma, local sovereignty, freedom of movement, and the global community, with three distinguished guest panelists, Jason Brennan, Natalia, Molina, and Jan Ting. The event tonight is part of our larger spring series of events at the college on the theme, Who is My Neighbor? Immigration, Freedom, and Community. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm professor of religion and philosophy at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring our event this evening, and the spring series just mentioned. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and sustain free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing the event tonight, very special thanks go to the staff of the Institute, Administrative Assistant Shannon Regier and Assistant Director Greg Seams. I'm deeply grateful for all they do in support of the Institute and the college. Thanks also to Molly Work and Carrie Vanderveen of Marketing and Communications, and Jeff O'Donnell and his broadcast media services crew for their contributions to our event tonight. Finally, thanks to students Ezra Garcia, Jervon Ngumba, and Vilma Rivera for helping us this evening. And now to introduce our guest panelists, moving from the audience's left to right. First, we're pleased to have with us Jason Brennan, the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. Jason is also a research professor at the University of Arizona's Freedom Center and Department of Political Economy and Moral Science. He's the author of 9 books, most recently one co-authored with Bas van der Wazen, entitled In Defense of Openness, Why Global Freedom is the Humane Solution to Global Poverty, published in 2018. In that book, Jason and his co-author address the immigration issue and argue for open borders. While Jason is a libertarian of sorts, and while libertarianism might be marshaled in support of an open borders policy, he and his co-author do not rest their case for open borders on any deep libertarian theory, but rather on fundamental moral intuitions that they claim are commonly held by thoughtful persons, whether or not they subscribe to libertarian theory. Next, we're pleased to have with us Natalia Molina, Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. Natalia has also served as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Faculty Diversity and Equity at the University of California at San Diego, and as Associate Dean of Arts and Humanities there. She is an historian and indeed a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. Natalia's scholarly work lies at the intersections of race, gender, culture, and citizenship, and she is the author of 2 award-winning books, Fit to be Citizens, Health and Race in Los Angeles, 1879 to 1939, published in 2006, and How Race is Made in America, Immigration, Citizenship, and the Historical Power of Racial Scripts, published in 2014. In that second book, Natalia analyzes what she calls the immigration regime in the United States in the 20th century, with particular attention to the construction of race and citizenship as such applies to Mexicans and Mexican Americans. She argues that this immigration regime reflected a fundamental class conflict obscured by the so-called racial scripts that predominated during the period. In Natalia's account, the racist discourse of certain racial scripts divided the oppressed, for example, Mexicans, blacks, Native Americans, poor whites, among others, and impeded the development of a sense of solidarity among the oppressed. In response, and with an eye to a new immigration regime for the 21st century, Natalia identifies and calls for what she characterizes as resistance counterscripts of various sorts that foster solidarity among the oppressed, advance the struggle for social justice, and humanize immigration policy. Finally, we're pleased to have with us Jan C. Ting, Professor Emeritus at Temple University Beasley School of Law, where he has taught in the areas of citizenship, immigration, and tax law. He received the Provost Outstanding Faculty Service Award in 2015 and the Temple Law Alumni Association Murray H. Schusterman Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2016. He also served as Assistant Commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service of the U.S. Department of Justice from 1990 to 1993. And he is currently on the Board of Directors of the Center for Immigration Studies. Jan believes that the United States has, and I quote from his writing, the most generous legal system, immigration system in the world, end of quotation. In recent essays, he's criticized former President Obama's DAPA policy for executive overreach and has expressed doubts about the legality of President Obama's DACA policy. Most recently, he has suggested that President Trump's proposed border wall might be paid for by Social Security funds withheld from undocumented immigrants who have used stolen or counterfeit Social Security numbers. Generally, Jan argues for the appropriateness of U.S. restrictions on immigration and for the firm enforcement of U.S. immigration law as sound social policy. There are many other things we could say about the accomplishments of our distinguished guests, but enough has been said to make the case for their distinction. Would you join me in welcoming them? The title of our event tonight highlights a collision of values at the heart of the current immigration controversy and suggests questions generated by the assertion of those values. So, with respect to the value of local or national sovereignty, should immigration policy be left mainly to nation states, presumed to have a right to determine how porous their boundaries will be? And do such nation states have a moral right to privilege their own citizens in these determinations? Regarding the value of freedom of movement, do individuals in the world have a moral right to move anywhere so long as they avoid violating the rights to life, liberty, and property of other individuals? And does such a right of movement then morally override rights of national sovereignty, however such sovereignty may be recognized in international law? Regarding the value of global community, are there human rights of asylum to be asserted against both sovereign and individual rights in cases of groups fleeing persecution? Do nations have an obligation to open their borders to groups suffering from severe or relative economic deprivation? How does race, ethnicity, gender, religion, culture, merit, for example, skill assessment, play? How do these things play in thinking about these matters? How should they play in thinking about these matters? Do we need to distinguish ideals from realities or pragmatics as we reflect on immigration policy? There are other questions we might identify. Those in the audience have their own. But let's now turn to our panel to see what these think about these and related matters. And we'll begin with Jason.
Great. Thank you very much for having me here today, and I'm glad to be on this distinguished panel to talk to you with what I think is, quite frankly, the most important issue we can talk about by maybe an order of magnitude. It's even more important than climate change. That's how important it is. That's the issue of immigration. So to quote and maybe paraphrase my friend Brian Kaplan, opening borders, allowing people to move anywhere they like at will, in the way that I'm free to move from Virginia to Minnesota at will without any legal requirements or any legal restrictions, is the humanitarian, egalitarian, libertarian, utilitarian way to double world product. So why aren't we doing it? And I said double world product. What I mean by this is economists, and I wonder how many people here are economics majors? Anyone? A few of you. So for those of you who are economics majors, in micro, you remember taking, and maybe more advanced classes, you remember doing a thing where you would study import quotas. How do you look at the dead weight loss of import quotas on things like jackets and watches and shoes? And there's a way of measuring these things. And when economists go to measure all of the loss to world welfare from all trade restrictions based upon the movement of goods, their high estimate is that it's a loss of about 5% of world product. We're 5 percentage points poorer in the world than we otherwise would be. But when we turn to looking at freedom of movement and immigration restrictions, because what it is to restrict labor in the first place and restrict people from moving, ultimately in the first analysis is a restriction on the mobility of labor. It's an import quota on labor. How much of a deadweight loss is that? Economists debate this. A low estimate, a rather conservative estimate, is that it's about 50% of world product. A high estimate is that it's about 150% of world product. The mean estimate is that it's 100% of world product, and that's the most common estimate in the literature. What does that mean? What I mean is that immigration restrictions are so darn inefficient that we're cutting world production in half. We should be producing about $200 trillion worth of services and goods in the world right now, but we only produce $100 trillion because we make it incredibly hard for people to move where their labor is most valued. So that seems like a pretty big deal. What this tells us is that if people start listing the downsides of immigration, and often they just make up the downsides, they don't actually look to see what the data says, but even if there were downsides to immigration, they have to be like $100 trillion worth of downsides before the argument starts going against immigration rather than for it. So what are these purported downsides, and are any of them real? But keep in mind, we're cutting world product in half. And by the way, how does it affect people? Because the distribution, if we were to open borders and have people just trade with whomever they want and work wherever they want, live wherever they want, it's going to benefit some people more than others. So a really common argument that you hear is that, well, it will help the immigrants. They'll be made richer, and that's true. The average Nigerian who moves to the United States sees his or her income go by a factor of 20. The average Haitian who moves to the United States sees his or her income go up by a factor of 20. The average person from Mexico moves to the United States sees his or her income go up by a factor of about 3. It's true that it helps the people who move here, but what about domestic-born people? Well, this is something we study too, and the argument that people make is, if all these workers come into the United States or into Europe or into another rich country, they're going to depress native wages because they're going to be competing for the same jobs. Well, maybe, or maybe not. Whether that's true or not depends upon whether immigrants are what's called a substitute or a complement to domestic labor. A substitute is you buy one thing instead of the other. You buy Pepsi instead of Coke. A complement is something that makes something better. Like if you have Coke and you add rum to it, it becomes better. Right? If you have tacos and you add hot sauce, they become better. So it's actually an empirical question. Are immigrants mostly substitutes for domestic labor or complements to domestic labor? It turns out that for almost every person living in a rich first world country, that the immigrants who tend to come in are complements, not substitutes. Meaning almost everyone benefits financially from the influx of immigration. Their wages go up, not down, with the exception of one group, which is uneducated men. Men who have lower than a high school degree. They tend to, that's a high school diploma, they tend to see their wages go down, but only in the short term. So think about what that means. Imagine I have here a magic wand, and when I wave this magic wand, it's going to make everyone in this room richer except you. You're going to lose a little bit of money in the short term. That stinks, and you might not want me to wave the magic wand, but we can fix this problem, can't we? What we can do is, if we're all getting richer and you're not, we could just pay you a side payment to make up for your loss in the short term, and then you'd be happy too. We can do that with immigration. Most people win from immigration, a small percentage of people lose, and we can pay them off to make them win from it as well. In the long run, they win anyways. So it's $100 trillion of loss to the world economy, and economists agree on this. Left-wing economists, right-wing economists, centrist economists, socialist economists, libertarian economists, this is what they think. And the public doesn't listen and they don't care. Why? It's a big issue. Just to give you an idea of the perspective, like how big this is, climate change is a real serious issue, right? But when economists go to estimate what is the loss to the world economy in the next 100 years because of climate change, they think it's going to be like we're 20% poorer 100 years from now than we otherwise would have been but for climate change. Immigration is 50% poor, like we've cut the world in half right now. That's how bad it is. It's even worse than climate change. So that's the economic argument. What about the moral argument? Is there any moral argument in favor of freedom of movement? I think there is a basic moral argument. It goes something like this. If you want to hire me and I happen to live somewhere else, and then someone else imposes himself upon and says, no, you can't make that trade, well, who made him boss? Why does he get to decide that? Imagine there's a person, let's name him Marvin. This is a character named Starving Marvin after my friend Michael Huemer in one of his books. Starving Marvin is desperately poor, but if he could just get to the market, he'll be able to make a life-saving trade with other people that will make his income go up by a factor of 10. And there are people there at the market who want to buy what he has to sell. But right before he gets to the market, you show up and you put armed guards right in front of the market and you say, you can't go in that market and you can't sell your stuff to those willing buyers who want to trade with you. We're going to prevent them using literal violence and threats of violence with guns, stop you from making this trade. Well, if you did that, it's not your fault he was poor in the first place, but it is your fault that he remains poor. If he starves as a result of you doing this, it's your fault that he starves. This is very different, by the way. I'm not arguing for charity. It's very different from if I'm walking down the street in Washington, D.C., and a homeless person asks me for money and I say no. I haven't hurt him, I just haven't helped him. This would be more like I see a homeless person like washing someone's car and I run up with a gun and I go, no, you can't do that, and scare them away. In that case, I actively intervene in a way that harms people. So that's what immigration restrictions are. They are a restriction on labor, which impoverishes almost everybody by a significant degree, and on the first glance, they appear to be really morally opprobrious. So what, if anything, could justify that? You have to find some real major downsides to immigration before the argument goes the other way. So people list a bunch of downsides, but they turn out usually not to be true. One purported downside is that immigrants cause a lot of crime. Problem is, they don't. This has been studied at great length by a number of different economists and a number of different sociologists. And the worst thing we can say about immigrants who come in, including, by the way, illegal immigrants, aside from the act of illegal immigration itself, looking at things like shoplifting, murder rates, theft, other kinds of crimes, is that they commit crime at a much lower rate than the people who are born here. The problem with immigrants is if they live here long enough, after about 3 generations, they become almost as crime-like as domestic-born Americans. That's what happens. They're actually lower crime people than in almost every country you look at. The immigrants cause less crime than the people who are born in that country. So what other arguments might people make? Well, they might say something like, well, they'll ruin our culture. I'm not so sure about that. So if you think about where in the places in the US are the places where culture is being created, you're probably going to think of places like Los Angeles and New York and places that are high levels of immigration. And the reason for that, if you think about in the past where culture is being created, Athens in ancient Greece, not Sparta, Athens. What you find in places like this is that it's always places where lots of people of different mentalities and different background cultures coming together and coalescing and sharing ideas. So the places with a lot of immigration in the US are the places where culture gets created. The places with very little immigration are, unfortunately, the cultural wastelands, like where I grew up in New Hampshire. Not much is being done there. Further, what you think of as culture is always a fusion of past ideas. Take country music in the United States. Where does country music come from? They play the banjo. That's a West African instrument. They play the guitar. That's ultimately a Persian instrument through Spain. The most common chord movement in American country music comes from West Africa, right? Culture is a mix of things. So it's not culture. They say, well, you know what? We have a right to self-determination. It's our country, and we can decide just to exclude people for no reason at all. And often they'll pick an argument like, this is what people say to me. They're like, well, Jay, you're always saying that we should have open borders, but you have an extra bedroom in your house. Will you let Haitians just move into your house at will? I'm like, no, I don't, frankly. And they're like, aha, see, you don't really mean it because you don't just let Haitians move into your house. The problem with that analogy is that a nation is not like a house. Right? It's not a good analogy. We, the people of the United States, do not own the land of the United States. You own some land, you own some land, you own a business, you own something different. We all individually own different things, and we make different trades with different kinds of people. So this analogy would be more like the rest of you have decided, I want to rent my house out to someone from Haiti, and you say no. I want to give a job to someone from Haiti, and you say no. It's not me deciding. We don't collectively own the country. Right? That's a false analogy. So what are some other complaints that people have? They say, well, you know, the problem is that if we allow people to move here at will, everyone's going to move here overnight and just swarm our infrastructure. So we have to have a controlled influx of immigrants because we can't just have open borders. You know, if you go around surveying people and ask them, would you be willing to move to the United States if you could, you get like 2 billion people saying they would. So if we just open borders, 2 billion people are going to move here tomorrow. I mean, what will that do to the roads? It's not true, right? And here's how you know it's not true. One, they do surveys like this within the United States. They ask Minnesotans, how many of you would like to move out of Minnesota? And half of you say you would, and then you don't. So you don't really mean it, right? You're just kind of emoting. The other reason we know this is because the disparities of income we see between the US and other countries, or between Singapore and other countries, also exist within the United States. Right? And we don't see mass immigration in a way that overwhelms infrastructure. To give you an example, I live in Fairfax County, Virginia. Fairfax County, Virginia is one of the richest counties in the US. It's like us in Loudoun County. We like fight it out every year. Median household income in my neighborhood is like $200,000. 75% of people have a bachelor's degree or higher. Oh, and by the way, it's 30% Muslim. People are always like, would you like to live in a neighborhood that's 30% Muslim? I'm like, I do, it's fine. So, we also, however, have open borders with Harlan County, Kentucky. Harlan County, Kentucky has a GDP per capita roughly between 1/6 and 1/8 of what Fairfax County, Virginia has. They have a very high crime rate, very high rates of drug use, very high unemployment, and a low degree of skills. All of those people are free to move to Fairfax whenever they want without having to ask permission from anybody in government who ever worked on that stuff. And they don't overwhelm our infrastructure, and they don't move. Why not? Well, it's because partly there's some problems with our legal structure that prevent them. I don't want to say it's all that. It's not because we have perfect things. But part of the issue here is that people respond to economic incentives, right? People are going to move when they expect to have their income go up and when they have job opportunities and so on. So you don't, even within the United States, you see these massive disparities of income, and you don't have all the poor people move to where all the rich people are and then ruin it. And I'm not trying to be mean to poor people when I say that. The reason I bring this up is because that's one of the main arguments that people make against open borders. They say, if we allow open borders, then all the poor people in the world will arrive in the US and just swamp our institutions. And that brings me to like the last objection people have. They go, we can't have open borders because everyone will overuse the welfare state. It's a really weird argument. So imagine you have a person who lives in Haiti and they're very, very poor, and they could move to the United States and get paid 10 times to 20 times what they're currently making, like even adjusting for the cost of living in the US. They'd be much better off if we let them move. But you're like, but we can't afford to pay them welfare, and they would come and consume the welfare. If that is your worry, that doesn't give you an argument for forbidding them from moving. At most, it gives you an argument for restricting their access to the welfare state. I'm not necessarily endorsing that as a conclusion, by the way, but I want to say that because you should note when somebody offers an argument against open borders, often their complaint is a complaint like that, and the solution isn't to restrict immigration. At most, it's maybe to restrict access to one particular thing or to have what's called a pigeonhole solution to the problem. So again, I think the moral and economic case for something close to open borders is pretty overwhelming, and that's the default position from which departures have to be justified. Thank you.
Jason, Natalia?
Thank you. Jason asked, one of the questions he asked was, if I've given you all these reasons why we should have open borders, why don't we? And I would argue that another reason to add to his argument is histories of race-making practices, how we think about race. And so right now I'm teaching a Latinx LA history course, so looking at the history of Latinos in Los Angeles. And one of the first things that I do is ask my students, what terms do you use for Latinos? And they come up with every kind of term, right? Mexican, Central American, Latinx, Latino, Chicano, Hispanic, Hispano, and we talk about how these categories have been shaped by region, by time, but also just how these are categories that we construct as human beings. They're social constructs. And so if we even look at the term of Mexican and the way that it developed historically, much of it has been around these race-making practices that even originally constructed them as outside the U.S. So Mexicans come into the U.S. after the 1846-48 Mexican-American War under a treaty. At the time that they're admitted in 1848, the only people that are allowed to become citizens are whites. But under this treaty, Mexicans are allowed. And this is one of the reasons that people protested the U.S. going to war against Mexico at this time period, because they knew if we win, what are you going to do with all these Mexicans in this country? And so they're allowed to become citizens. It's a legal treaty. But they're not really accepted socially and culturally. And this becomes one of the questions that vexes Mexican immigration for years to come then. It gets debated in state courts. It gets debated in Supreme Court. It gets debated in terms of intermarriage laws, property laws, where they can live, where they can work, where they can play, where they can go to school. Even, one of the precursors to Brown v. Board, the first school segregation case is the Lemon Grove case in the 1930s in San Diego. Another one is in 1948 in the Los Angeles area in Westminster versus Mendez. So all these cases around, exactly what are Mexicans? And this is part of the reason that we continue to debate this today, is because we think about them not just as immigrants devoid of race, but through these race-making practices. So one of the things when you're teaching that you always want to get across is, yes, things today may seem like things did in the past, but there are also key differences. So the day that we studied the construction of the U.S.-Mexico in the 1924 Immigration Act. My students were like, aha, we now are on the day that the U.S. government has been shut down for the longest period possible. See, people didn't like immigrants then, they don't like immigrants now, nothing has changed. I'm like, well, not quite. We didn't even have the Border Patrol in 1924. Many people are surprised to learn this. It's not created until 1924 under the Department of Labor. And at this time period, the 1924 Immigration Act is actually an act that's directed mainly at Southern and Eastern Europeans, because whites are thought to be in a hierarchy at this time. Historians have called them these ethnic immigrants like Irish and German and Jews as a hierarchy of Caucasians. And Mexicans were not put on these quotas at this time. Why? Because employers did not want them to be put on quotas. You also have different officials that kind of step in to say, well, how can we make this a more palatable community? I know, we actually want to offer them services. We want to offer Americanization services. We want to offer schooling. We want to offer all these things to help incorporate them and make them a great labor force. So they're incorporated, but sort of in a hierarchy there. And so when we talk about, this government shutdown then, being built around a wall, it's not quite the same thing, because at this point you actually have people advocating for the continued immigration of Mexicans. That doesn't mean that there weren't a lot of what I call racial scripts going on at this time, these kind of long-standing what we might think about as stereotypes that both are shaped by structural forces like laws and policies, as well as by cultural forces like narratives, like images. And so when we do justify something like a government shutdown around a wall because of hordes of people coming and invasions of people coming, it is drawing on these stereotypes that have been in place for a long time. People often like to blame those who are in power right now, but they're drawing on these racial scripts that are long-standing. The reason that they have such power is because we've heard them before. And so, my students also, just turned in their papers. I was reading them on the airplane. And one thing they do is they look up primary sources. And so some of the primary sources they found are of Mexican Americans being deported in the 1930s. Many of them children, many along with their families. Citizenship can't even guard them, can't even protect them from being seen as outsiders. Why? Because that script, that racialization of them as outsiders is so prominent. One of the other things that happened this semester, and again, that my students were like, aha, this is just like that, and then we kind of went and deconstructed that, was, we heard the State of the Union. And one of the things that President Trump described in the State of the Union was prison reform, right? That this woman who, he helped release with the help of Kim Kardashian, who brought this case to his attention, and then turned to immigration policy and why we needed a wall. And there was a quote that went around, one of these sound bites that went viral on the internet afterwards by Van Jones from CNN, who said, President Trump offered us dog poop and cookies, like dog poop meaning, talking about immigration in these negative ways, and cookies meaning we can talk about prison reform in these ways, in these positive ways. And so what we also see in that example is that when we talk about racialization, not all racialization is even. We can talk about some groups in positive ways and other groups in negative ways, and that these categories shift over time. And so we also need to see, why do some immigrants get to be seen as good immigrants and as assimilable and not others? So we also went back and talked about, the Depression and the 1930s again, how during the Depression there were deportation programs. At this point in my research, what I found, I was very interested in when we talk about paths to citizenship and anchor babies, when this discourse starts. I was thinking I'd go back to the 1990s. A lot of this actually goes back to the 1930s. And what we see in legislation at that point is that there's legislation being offered to white ethnic immigrants, that it's a depression, that they don't have jobs, but they are in mixed status families, where somebody is a citizen and somebody is not, and they've had an American-born child, and that it would be an undue hardship for them to be deported. And so as long as they didn't have a criminal record, they were allowed to stay in the United States. Such policies were not extended to Mexicans at this time period. As I mentioned, Mexicans were deported, even Mexican Americans. So we see these race-making policies in place early on. There was an article in the New Yorker recently on the decline of historical thinking. And that article talked about how we also need the humanities to just help us understand people's lives, people's life experience from a viewpoint other than ours. And so for me, I really appreciate being invited here tonight because we can talk about policy debates and we can talk about sort of net flows and income, but we also need to think about what this means in terms of our larger understandings about race. We also often hear that phrase, right? We want to understand our history, so we're not doomed to repeat it. I want more than that. I want us to be able to understand our history, so we can create a better future.
Thank you.
Thanks. In the time allotted to me, I'd like to see if I can squeeze in 3 points to put them on the table. The first point is that the real controversy in immigration policy in the United States is not whether we should admire and respect immigrants. Of course we should admire and respect immigrants. All Americans are either immigrants themselves or descendants of ancestors that came here from somewhere else. And we're told that's even true of Native Americans. People that know their own family's immigrant history always honor their ancestors, and think that they were great people. My favorite story is of the Australians, people in Australia. Their ancestors came as convicts and criminals who were being deported from their motherland. And the Australians, even the ones that aren't directly descendants, have adopted them as their ancestors, and they show a great deal of pride in their immigrant ancestors. The real issue, I would contend, is, as Jay suggests, how many? Given the fact that we admire and respect immigrants, how many immigrants should we take every year? And the basic issue is whether we should have a limit or not. Our inability to answer that question is what makes our immigration system appear to be broken. It's not Congress, it's not politicians, it's us. Our inability to answer that question, because if we could answer that question, our politicians in self-interest would follow suit. Think about what you think the limit should be. At what number do you think we should start saying no to people who just want a shot at a better life for themselves and their families, for which they will work hard, who are neither criminals nor terrorists, and who in fact remind us of our own ancestors? Or should we, as Jay suggests, have no limit and take everyone? One of my economist colleagues at Temple has said that the poor people of the world may be poor, but they're not stupid, and that they're in fact as capable as anyone in this room, he used to say, at using cost-benefit analysis to determine what's in their own self-interest. And they do so every day, just like we do. And so if the benefits outweigh the costs of immigrating to the United States, they will come to the United States. It's in their interest to do so. If the costs, the dangers, and the expense of immigrating to the United States are greater than the benefits, they will not immigrate to the United States. Those are the laws of economics that some economists observe. I'm a lawyer, and like many lawyers, I think I could argue both sides of every question. And this is no exception. There's certainly a coherent, intellectually defensible argument on each side. And whichever side you end up on, whether you think there should be a limit or not, that is going to suggest your position on all the other peripheral issues in immigration. If I know whether you're for a limit or not, I know what you think about DACA and sanctuary cities and the travel ban and even the border wall, right? I mean, that follows from your belief that we should have a limit or not. But here's the thing, point 2. The big idea of the American experiment, the American Revolution, the American Constitution, is that the American people can govern themselves through our elected leaders without a king. That was a revolutionary idea in its time, and it's still a revolutionary idea today. And to borrow Lincoln's language, we are constantly testing whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure through our elected leaders. It's the job of the elected members of Congress to weigh all of the conflicting demands on immigration policy. That's why we pay them the big bucks. Employers always want a bigger labor pool. A, because they want to hire the best people they can, and so the bigger labor pool helps them do that more efficiently. And they want to pay the lowest wages they can. And a bigger labor pool has always been a way for employers to play, immigrant workers against native-born workers and keep wages low. So it's not surprising that Mark Zuckerberg and Michael Bloomberg and Jeff Bezos all want more immigrants. That's not surprising. But there are, in fact, conflicting concerns over the effect of immigration on wages and jobs for American workers. And you may have heard there are some dire concerns out there about the effect of automation, artificial intelligence, and continued outsourcing. You may have heard there are even experiments on whether the government should just start paying people for not working, because there isn't going to be enough work in the future, according to some futurists. Should we pay attention to that? Are those issues that belong on the plate? So this is why we have a Congress, right? We govern ourselves through these elected representatives. And I think they have done their job. They have, on our behalf, made a decision that we are going to have a limit, and they have specified what that limit is going to be. It's a complex formula that sets the number in effect at around, typically, 1 million permanent legal immigrants every year are allowed into the United States. And the laws specify which immigrants are allowed to get these permanent visas and which are not. Who gets in, who doesn't, and who's deportable if they come in without our authorization. And as was suggested, I've written that this is in fact the most generous legal system in the world, bar none, that we admit every year that roughly 1 million figure of permanent immigrants, they can live here forever. And they have a clear path to full citizenship. Sometimes we call them green card immigrants, right? They have green card immigration. We give out more green cards every year than all the rest of the nations of the world combined. So that's not bad for a nation of immigrants. They have done their job, and it is the obligation of everyone who works in the executive branch under our Constitution to faithfully execute the laws of the United States, right? If you work in the executive branch of government, you have a constitutional obligation to faithfully execute the laws of the United States as enacted by our Congress. And if we disagree with those laws, we are all free to try and change Congress, as many of us have done, and as we will have another opportunity soon, next year. We're going to have an opportunity to elect a new Congress and a new president, and we can affect immigration policy directly. That's the idea. That's the American idea of how our system works and how our Constitution works. These laws are not the moral equivalent of the Fugitive Slave Act, right? They're not. Every country in the world has immigration laws. The U.S. is no exception, except for the fact that I think we have the most generous legal immigration laws in the world of any country. Most developed countries don't even have a green card immigration system, right? You can't go to Germany or Japan and say, oh, I love your country. I think I'd just like to live here forever and become a citizen of your country. It's very hard to do that. The third and last point I want to make is something that's been in the press a lot, and that is, who is a refugee? Who is entitled to asylum in the United States? And the point I want to make is that there's an international definition of who is a refugee. And you have to meet that international definition in order to qualify for asylum in the United States. Asylum is discretionary. The government can grant it to whoever they want, but in order to qualify, you have to meet the international definition, and if you don't, you're not even qualified for asylum in the United States. The international definition was incorporated in the 1951 International Convention on Refugees. The United States did not adhere to that until 1967, and the U.S. did not implement that standard until the 1980 Refugee Act. The standard is a narrow standard. That's the important thing to know. You have to have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of 5 factors: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group. If you're not in that category, you're not a refugee, and you're not entitled to asylum in the United States. And why did the drafters of the International Convention make such a narrow standard? If, for example, you're a victim of climate change or some natural disaster, earthquake, right? Every home in your country has been destroyed by an earthquake. There's no economic activity at all. You have to come to the United States in order to survive. Are you a refugee? Under the international definition, you are not, right? Not because of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group. You're just a victim of natural disaster. What if there's simply no work in your country? I can't support my family. I can't earn enough money to buy food for my family. Therefore, I have to come to the United States. I have no alternative. Are you a refugee? Answer, no, you're not a refugee under the international definition. What if there's random violence in my country? And I stick my head out my door and there's bullets flying around. I can't live there. I've got to come to the United States. Am I a refugee? No. You're not under that definition. What if there's a civil war going on? I'm just sitting in my home. I don't have a stake in this civil war, and bombs are dropping on my home. My neighbors are dying. So I have to get out. I have to get my family out. Are we refugees? No. Under the international definition, you're not. Why did they draft that definition so narrowly? And the answer is, at the end of World War II, they knew that they needed a convention on refugees, but they were fearful that if it was too broad, countries would not ratify it. And indeed, the United States was one of the leaders of the no-ratify resistance. We didn't ratify it for the longest time because we felt it was an infringement on national sovereignty. So that's why the definition was so narrowly written, and that was incorporated into U.S. law today. That's the standard for refugees. Social group is an important issue. It was a last term added back in the early 1950s. What were they thinking? Initially, they thought race, religion, nationality, and political opinion. That's what they wanted to protect. Why did they add social group? And I think, it's a good thesis paper for somebody to write on if they want. Well, what was the origin of the term social group? I think you'll find that what people were thinking of at that time was a Russian imperial family, that they were, as you may know, persecuted to death down to the last child, not because of their race, not because of their nationality, and not because of their religion, not because of their political opinion, but because of something else. And social group was intended to cover that something else, and courts have elaborated on that, and they said it's like an immutable characteristic, something that you can't change. And it's something that has boundaries. So a social group, you have to know who's in and who's out. And those are the characteristics of a social group. So, for example, I think persecuted homosexuals, clearly have an immutable characteristic, and social boundaries. You know who's in and who's out. But that's the definition that we've got to work with in social group. So it's narrowly restricted, and I think based on our understanding of that, gives us greater insight on what's going on at the southern border. Thank you.
Now there might be occasion for any of you to respond to what others are saying on the panel. I invite.
I have a point, and that is on this issue of crime, as whether that's significant or not. I mean, there have been some significant crimes by illegal aliens in this state, and high-profile things. And the distinguishing, first of all, I mean, I call into question statistics on particularly illegal immigrants. It's not surprising that legal immigrants have a low rate of crime, right? If you're a legal immigrant to the United States with a green card, you've like hit the jackpot, right? You're one of the lucky people in the world, and you're not going to commit a lot of crime. I think it's very hard to determine who's illegal. We can determine who's foreign-born and compile statistics accordingly. I think very hard to determine people's immigration status for purposes of criminal statistics. But even if it were true, I don't think it's true, but even if it were true that immigrants had a comparable rate of crime compared to the native-born population, the point is crimes committed by illegal aliens are avoidable crimes, right? There's nothing you can do about your neighbor going bananas and shooting up a school if they're native-born Americans. You can't, like, deport them. But if we simply enforced our immigration laws enacted by Congress in accordance with the American Constitution, we could avoid all the crimes being committed by illegal aliens in the United States. So that's my response to Jay.
Absolutely, there are lots of avoidable crimes because we know things about who commits crime. So here are some things we could do. From now on, no one living in West Virginia is allowed to reproduce. However, that's avoidable. All those crimes are avoidable. White people living in West Virginia commit crime at a very high rate. So we don't let them reproduce, and we only allow white people from New Hampshire, they can reproduce. Black people living in Fairfax County, Virginia, they're allowed to reproduce and have kids, but not black people living in Ward 8. All these things of DC, all these things are they're crimes we can stop. We can identify particular groups and say, people like you tend to commit crime at a high rate and people like you tend not to. We don't have to make it about, we can be very specific about where they're living, what their demographic factors are, and we can reduce a lot of crime that way. And me even suggesting this as a possibility makes you go, and you're horrified, as you should be, because it's an illiberal imposition, even though it's true that these are avoidable crimes. That said, and you can doubt all the stuff that you want, but there's a vast body of literature in economics studying this 50 different ways, and the literature says that immigrants, regardless of whether their other background legal status, commit crime at a much lower rate than domestic-born Americans of any nationality. Right? What happens to immigrants over time is after about 3 generations, they start to catch up with the very crime-like domestic-born Americans. So I don't know. I don't think that's actually the central problem with immigration restriction arguments. People say, here's a reason to restrict immigration, and these arguments never simply imply we should restrict immigration. They always imply we should do other things as well. Restrict, people's religion, restrict people's other freedoms. It's never clear why it stops at immigration. So I have a question for you though, which has to do with the number. So maybe the U.S. has a very nice, compared to other countries, immigration policy. Maybe it has a very restrictive one. That's an interesting question. But how do they come up with the number 1 million? Because if you take in economics, except in really special cases, governments are not smart enough to set prices. They can't tell you that shoes should cost $30 or $60, whatever these cost. They can't tell you that a watch should cost $500. They can tell you that a Honda Civic should cost $1,650. They don't know how to determine what the price is. So where would they come up with that number 1 million? And why is that a good number? Why shouldn't it be 5 million or 500,000? And further, if they're so good at figuring out how many immigrants the U.S. needs, presumably they'd be good at figuring out how many immigrants Virginia needs. So they could reasonably come up with a number and say, well, Virginia needs 40,000 people from Massachusetts, and that's all it needs. And Massachusetts needs nobody. No one can move to Massachusetts. Shouldn't the government also be smart enough to figure out these numbers and perhaps have internal immigration restrictions rather than just immigration restrictions between the U.S. and other countries?
Well, short answer to that is no. There are constitutional restrictions on the ability.
I'm not asking about the legality of it. I'm asking about why isn't it a good idea from an economic perspective. I don't want to talk about law. I want to talk about what would be what's the reason for it.
I don't think you can ignore the legal aspects. We live under a constitution, right? We live under a rule of law.
Right, but I'm not asking about that. I'm asking a very specific question, which is about why is it not. If the government is smart enough to come up with a number for how many immigrants we need from elsewhere, it should presumably be smart enough to be able to tell how many immigrants this town needs and how many people Minnesota needs from other states in the U.S.
First of all, they don't come up with the number. They come up with a formula. They come up with categories of immigrants that are going to be authorized to come into the United States. That formula works out typically to about 1 million every year, but it certainly varies from year to year. So the government isn't setting a number, but they're setting a set of laws that say we're going to take so many people people in this category and so many people in this category, and everyone else who qualifies gets into a line, and they wait. And when we go through the waiting list, then maybe you'll get your chance. And some of the lines are 20 years long. There are people in the Philippines who are legally qualified to come to the United States because they're siblings of American citizens. There's a category for siblings of American citizens, but there are a lot of people in the Philippines that want to come. They've been waiting more than 20 years for their chance to immigrate legally. That's part of the reality that we can't ignore, that people have been waiting this long for their chance. These are people who observed our laws. Meanwhile, people that defied our laws are kind of jumping the queue ahead of them all the time. That's part of the reality of the system, too.
Jan, Natalia?
Just, I go back to the example that I gave earlier about deportation, and before that, the 1924 Immigration Act. So laws, we have the 1924 Immigration Act that puts people on a quota. And so all of a sudden, if you're that number, if you're immigrant, if your quota for your country is 1,000, and you're immigrant 1,000 plus 1, you get deemed illegal and get constructed in a way as seen as, unworthy. And the only difference is you got in the queue one after 1,000 than one before. But, the other part of that is that even at that point, and, we have other mechanisms since, certain immigrants were allowed to make themselves legal. So Southern and Eastern European immigrants living near the Canadian border were told by immigration agents, why don't you go to Canada and why don't you re-enter? And therefore you can become a legal immigrant. Mexicans living on the U.S.-Mexico border, if they were here less than 5 years, every time they crossed the border, their immigration clock started again, which meant that they could have been here 5, 10, 20, 30 years, but every time they crossed the U.S.-Mexico border, if there was a funeral, if there was a parent who was sick, if they decided to move back to Mexico for a time period, then they also were then in danger of being deported. And yet people would live here for 5, 10, 20, 30 years without any problems until there were things like recessions. And so I guess the other thing about immigration policy that doesn't make sense from a historical perspective is that we see time periods like the Depression into the 1940s where the U.S. is continuing to deport immigrants to Mexico at the same time that they're constructing the Bracero program, the 1942 to 1964 labor program that brought in Mexicans to fill labor shortages at this time period. And so you also see the ways in which you're bringing immigrants in. And to me, the problem with programs like that is that you're fine with the immigrants as long as they're doing the labor, and as soon as that labor is not needed, they're returned back. 1965, you have the 1965 Immigration Act, which changes those numbers again. So the numbers aren't also infallible, they change. And so all of a sudden you have this large immigrant stream that's been coming for years. People have been settling. Employers like it that they get the same employees because we may call it cheap labor, but it's not unskilled labor. Having somebody that knows how to handle your livestock, having someone that knows how to handle farm equipment, having someone who knows how to tend to your crops. This is skilled labor. They want to see these same immigrants coming back. And so once that program is over and those immigration laws change, people continue to come back. They're doing the same work as they were doing before, but now they're considered illegal because they don't fit those numbers anymore.
No one is arguing, nor could anyone argue, that American immigration law has not been, replete with mistakes. It's replete with mistakes now. There are things that are wrong now by anyone's agreement. And we had a discussion over dinner of the Chinese Exclusion Act. That was wrong. That's actually the fountainhead of the U.S. immigration system. The U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the United States could keep Chinese people out of the United States on the basis of race if it wanted to. Well, if you can do that, what can't you do, right? And it sort of went to the head of the Congress that, we can do basically anything in the area of immigration, and that's not far from the truth. Today we have a green card lottery. Have you ever heard of that? The green card lottery is kind of a crazy thing where this valuable green card, we give it out as a lottery. But guess what? No Mexicans need apply. No Chinese need apply. Can you do that? Can the government run a lottery that says no Mexicans or Chinese or Filipinos can apply? Oh, yes, you can. people, the legal immigrants who are standing in line for a chance to come into the United States, if you're Mexican or Filipino, you have to stand in a line longer than everyone else's, right? You may be in the same category. And if you're Mexican or Filipino, you stand in a longer line, sometimes many times longer. That's why these Filipino fourth preference siblings are standing in lines more than 20 years long. It's not just because they're in the fourth preference, which is backlogged, but they're from the Philippines. We got enough of them, right, in the United States. That's what Congress is saying. Can you do that in the United States? I've often argued with my activist colleagues that if they were to take on these wrongs in the immigration law today, they would get unanimous support and they'd be able to fix those things immediately, rather than pie-in-the-sky solutions that are really not viable given the political realities. Congress is constantly juggling the pressures that they're under. Big business wants more immigration, right? And on the other hand, there's all this resistance. One of my colleagues, David Martin at the University of Virginia, is concerned that if we widen the window for refugees into the United States, which we could do, right? Congress can change the law any time on who's qualified as a refugee. They have simply incorporated the international standard. But my colleague is concerned that if we widen it too widely, it may lead to the implosion of the asylum and refugee system in the United States. You only have to look at what's going on all over the world to understand that is the political reality that we're facing. What did the United States do before we adhered to the Refugee Act of 1980? We had a system of, what's in the best interests of America decided who got asylum. So people from certain countries could get asylum, but people from other countries could not in the United States, because the standard was what's in the best interests of the United States. We could easily go back. You can imagine that the current administration might like to go backwards to that system. And there is a political backlash that is part of the reality that has to be taken into consideration when we start tinkering with the immigration system. It's a reality not just in the United States, but all over the world. There is a realistic limitation to how much immigration we can take in. It's a political limitation.
But in some measure, it sounds to me like the arguments are flying by each other. Because what I hear being said here is that, as a matter of principle, ideally speaking, from the moral point of view, things ought to be more open than what they actually are. I don't hear you here and now, although I think in some of your writings you may have said things like there have got to be limits. But I hear you saying now limits have to be recognized as a political constraint, a political reality. So you're really making different kinds of points.
Absolutely. It's a new reality. It's not a reality that I would have made before maybe 2016. But I think since 2016, we have to recognize that there is a reality out there. And, if you want to reelect the incumbent, there's a way to do that, right? A campaign on the basis of abolishing ICE, no more deportations, unlimited immigration, that will get the president reelected. And if that's what you want, that's the position that you want to take.
Okay. Are there reactions to this? Or?
Yeah, so you're right, there is a mix here because we're making both normative and economic arguments about a certain policy, and you're talking about the politics. But I want to say that, I've written 3 books on political behavior and voter behavior, and you're right about the politics, though not in a way that I think really hurts my argument. Here's the thing. It's true that, the stuff I'm advocating is pie in the sky in the following sense. There's no way people are going to vote for it next year or 20 years from now. It's not pie in the sky in the sense that, a communist utopia is pie in the sky, which would require a fundamental change in human motivations and behavior and require them to be much more altruistic than they are. The thing I'm advocating is compatible with unfortunate facts about human nature, including our limited altruism and selfishness and so on. and it's not even destructive. It helps the country. So why don't countries support it? Why is there such a massive disconnect between the thing that politicians say and then the thing that the research says? Keep in mind that the research is being done by people of a wide range of different political persuasions. It's not like just libertarians or just socialists or just conservatives. This is what all the economists agree on. Like, this is what we're debating, and this is what the politicians debate. The answer for this is because democracy incentivizes people not to know about this very well and not to understand it. So just to explain why, imagine you were in a class this size, and I'm your professor, and I say, 15 weeks from now, you're going to have a final exam that's worth 100% of your grade. However, I'm going to average all of your final exams together. You won't get your score, you won't get your score. Rather, you're all going to get the same score, the average of everyone's test on this final exam 15 weeks from now. Now let me ask you, how hard would you study? Anyone here is putting a lot of effort into studying? How many people would just slack off and not bother? Most of you? St. Olaf students, you just don't care about. No, the problem here isn't that like you have bad motives. It's not that you're lazy. It's that if I had that incentive structure, you would have no incentive to be informed about whatever it is I'm teaching, because you're going to fail no matter what. If I study hard, I will fail, and if I don't study, I'll fail. I might as well binge Netflix. So that's what happens with immigration and economics and all these other issues. Having people vote on this stuff is like having a final exam, but the final exam has 220 million people in it, or potentially, it's usually a lot less than that, rather than having like the 60 people that are here in this room. So that's why the voters, when they don't have a strong incentive to learn the economics of immigration, they don't have any strong incentive to think carefully about it. They have every incentive to let loose all of their ethnic biases and racism and whatever other kinds of bad motivations they might have, because they will not be rewarded for being right and they will not be punished for being wrong. Your individual vote makes very little difference. Sorry, mine doesn't either. Mine makes a little bit more difference than yours usually because I'm from Virginia. But like, it doesn't matter very much. And because of that, you have no incentive to be well informed. And so for that reason, the public debate is, from an economic standpoint, completely innumerate and illiterate. Like, why are they even having this debate? And the politicians, when they come up with their magic numbers, they're catering to the ignorance of the voting population, not to the research and not to the literature, not to what the evidence is.
Libertarians have always been mystified at the inability of their message to penetrate a larger audience.
This isn't a libertarian argument, though. It's not special libertarian.
It's not a coincidence that every country in the world, to my knowledge, has immigration laws that restrict immigration, right? What a coincidence. I'm reminded of Winston Churchill's saying that democracy is the worst possible form of government in the world, except for all the others. We just haven't been able to think of anything better than having elected representatives, weigh all the arguments that are being made and say, all right, here's where we're going to draw the line. That's the system that we have, and it has a methodology for us to change it if we choose to. And if we choose not to, and that's what Congress is saying when they defeat these various immigration reform acts, they're saying, you know what, we'd rather keep the system that we have in place now. We think that's better than all the other systems that have been proposed. We can change that any time, right, if we want to, and are willing to work hard at it. Meanwhile, there are little things that we could fix right now today. We could eliminate racial and ethnic discrimination in our immigration laws, on the green card lottery, on the so-called per-country cap. Why do they make Filipinos and Mexicans wait in longer lines to immigrate legally to the United States? Because we limit the percentage of visas to issue to any one country to 7%. Well, who does that affect? It doesn't affect Norway or Sweden or Denmark or Finland. It affects big countries with a lot of people that want to immigrate to the United States. It affects most of all Mexico and the Philippines, China, India, the Dominican Republic. We could eliminate that. That would be easy to form a movement to say, eliminate racial discrimination, drop racial and ethnic biases in the per-country caps and in the so-called green card lottery. We could fix that, but no, we want to pursue these larger, grandiose visions of change in the immigration system, which have been defeated again and again and again. There are things that we could do. It's a mystery to me why we're not doing them.
This is an interesting point, because I'm wondering, Natalia, it sounds to me like the proposal there might meet some of the concerns that you have about the current system, even though it falls short of what Jason is calling for. Is that a proper interpretation of how you might respond?
I think that all these laws should be seen within a racial frame, and so I can't cherry pick which ones to change. But what I would argue is, when we talk about your proposal of, well, if we advocate for abolish ICE and open borders and this, the president will win again. Again, I don't think a lot of these, or when people are making these arguments, they're making an argument around the racial frame. So it's not that all immigration, has to be open, but that concern about framing immigration from certain countries as so dangerous, that is the issue. And one of the ways we do that is to say that either we build a wall or we have open borders. One of the messages that just still doesn't get in is those points about most immigration to the U.S. Most people who are here undocumented actually come in legally, and they come in through legal ports of entry. Most drugs come in through legal ports of entry. Most immigrants are not committing crimes. These are the things that get lost when we frame it in these other ways, and it's hard to get these messages out. The idea of we don't have enough. That we're going to put this cap. I mean, what happens in the meantime then? What happens in the meantime is, I lived in San Diego for 17 years. Whenever I traveled to Mexico or South America, I flew out of Tijuana. It was the same distance from San Diego border to the Tijuana border, and I'd often get a direct flight. You cross the U.S.-Mexico border, and you stand in a line to get a taxi to the airport. Now there's a bridge, but for many years you stood in line. I was always there with many business people from the U.S. who were there to check on their factories, because the way that NAFTA is set up is that we build U.S. companies in Mexico, use Mexican labor over there, profit from it, and then bring the products back. And there's just this uneven labor force and uneven economy there that just addressing kind of cherry picking laws does not even begin to address, and therefore won't, I think, make a significant impact in the immigration policy and problems that we have now.
And therefore is not worth doing? Don't even bother with that. Don't bother with the discrimination against Mexicans in the green card lottery and in the per country cap. I mean, Mexicans are waiting years longer than other qualified immigrants for their chance to immigrate legally to the United States. But we're not going to do anything about that?
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is the reason that we have laws set up in that way are based on racial hierarchies. And so if we're going to do an analysis of these laws, we need to also consider the history of how these laws developed, and then use that to examine other laws as well. Rather than what often happens in politics, as you say, is things end up being a compromise. We'll do this, but then we won't do that. And that, I don't think, affects the larger conversation.
That's how progress occurs in the world, right? 2 steps forward and 1 step back. That's always been the process. We have to have a compromise. We have to solve the things that can be solved and postpone the things that we can't deal with right now. There are things that can be solved right now. We ought to deal with them.
I think now might be a time for opening things up to general Q&A. And so if people have questions, there's one here, I think. And please speak into a mic.
Yeah, one sec.
Thank you.
Where?
Hello, Mike Furstein, Philosophy Department. This is first to Jason, but the other panelists might have thoughts as well. Regarding the goods of immigration, the lack of, let's say, cultural conflict and so on, what do you think about the case of Germany as a kind of natural experiment in opening the gates? So Merkel opened things up. There was a flood of refugees. There have been some well-publicized problems, both with economic and cultural integration. I suspect that many conservatives, in fact, I know that many conservatives will point to that example and others like it in Europe as sort of case in point A against the idea that if we just open up the gates, there'll be no problems and it's going to be good for everyone.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question, but it's a good question because it's not actually relevant. Merkel did not do anything similar to what I was proposing, and it's important we keep in mind why. What I'm talking about is economic migration. I'm an economic migrant in the following sense. I lived in Providence, Rhode Island, and then I realized I could get paid twice as much as if I live in DC, so I moved to DC, right? I'm an economic migrant. I wasn't a refugee. Refugees are different. So if Merkel says there are a lot of people who are desperately poor in Syria who are moving because of an external shock or moving from other places like Lebanon and so on because of war, and they're desperate, and they're going to move here and we're going to give them a lot of welfare and a lot of kind of other sort of government-backed programs, and then maybe try to integrate them into the economy later, that's a different case of people. And the economics of that is quite a bit different. I'm talking about economic migration, people freely moving because they're fine here, but they see the better opportunity there, which is very different from like, I'm fleeing. So she didn't do the things that people like me are advocating. She just let in a lot of refugees, and they're just a different case. Now, there are things, though, that Germany does well, and I think some of the bad downsides are overplayed there in Germany. One thing you find, I do a lot of like looking at survey data about how people think of immigrants, and here's what you find around Europe. People who live near the immigrants are like, immigrants, yeah, and the people who don't live near them are like, the immigrants are a disaster and ruining our country. That's true of England, that's true of Germany, that's true of Poland, that's true of other countries. But Germany does some things pretty badly, and this is a way of restricting immigration without restricting immigration, and that is to have restrictive labor laws and other kinds of rules that make it difficult for people to actually get a job and to live in certain places, to actually integrate, and then you get people who are technically there and permitted to be there, but they can't ever really become a full-class citizen. They're not, the opportunities that are available to like a typical German person are not available to them. You see this, I mean, it's even worse, say, in France, where you have this sort of tiered system where, well, we allow all these people, Muslims from North Africa, to move here, but given the way their labor laws work and the way our universities work, they're never really going to be integrated into the country, and they're going to remain poor. So, I mean, some of the things that she's doing like that they haven't fixed are contributing to the problem.
Let me just say about Germany, the reason that there were so many refugees headed towards Germany and Sweden and other Western European countries is that those countries don't have a legal immigration system. Virtually the only way to immigrate to Germany is as a refugee. Well, if that's the only way and you want to go to Germany, you're going to say, hey, I'm a refugee, right? Let me in. So that's what's going on there. The other thing that I think we have to pay attention to, other people may disagree, but Angela Merkel has had to step down. Her political career is over in Germany. And there's no doubt that it's because of her immigration policy. And people can read the tea leaves, right? I mean, that's what it means to be in a democracy, that our elected leaders look at their political future, and rightly or wrongly, they make political decisions in their own self-interest. And that is by design, and as Churchill says, worst system, terrible system, except for all the others. We just don't have a better idea other than electing representatives and letting them do the best they can, weigh all the arguments, do the best you can.
Questions? There's a question here.
I think
No,
Trudeau's
right,
going to be
right.
forced out in Canada, too.
Right, there's a question here, student here.
Okay, so when considering DAPA and DACA, really specifically DACA, it's a really interesting concept for this discussion about immigration because we have this set group of people that we have here already in the United States based on merit, and that number is not really growing because of the cap that we set, I think in the 2012, anyone here before 2012? How does that, because we're not considering them flowing in or out of the United States, we're considering the acknowledgement of this group of people. What are your thoughts as a panel, economically, morally, politically, on specifically that group of people?
Natalia?
DACA's interesting, and it's as a historian, I think it's when we talk about these concepts, I always go back to case studies of where we've seen things happen, right? So if we talk about restricting immigration, what happens when you restrict immigration? DACA is an example of what happens. So 1980s, you have restrictions in immigration. You have immigration, IRCA, Immigration Reform and Control Act, and after that, you have all these restrictions on the border, Operation Gatekeeper with Bill Clinton, and what happens is that people decide, I can no longer engage in circular migration there is a way in which people are coming back and forth, making decisions about when they work, when they can't, building their retirement homes in Mexico. And once that becomes more difficult, people decide to stay. And so these, the children of DACA are the children of these immigrants. So there's also the ways that we need to examine. It's not like we make certain restrictions and then everything's solved. And, we need to then reckon with the byproduct of these immigration laws. And I would also say that, again, we need to see how many of these laws are inflected by race. So when we talk about, challenges to DACA, one of the examples, one of the people that was opposed to it was Representative Steve King. And one of his famous quotes is saying, for every DACA applicant, there's a Mexican teenager hauling marijuana across the desert with calves the size of cantaloupes. And so there's always that, even when you have like people trying to apply, and it's expensive, it's time consuming, you have to renew it. There are a lot of restrictions against it. Even when you have that, you still have this frame of this is a group that needs to be feared.
No one can deny that the DACA beneficiaries are the most sympathetic segment of the undocumented population in the United States, right? They are not here because of some deliberate choice on their own behalf. And because of that, I think, there was initially no legal challenge to DACA. No one challenged DACA, even though people complained about it and thought it was, an excessive use of presidential power. There was no court challenge to it. And if the Obama administration had just left it alone, it would have been fine. But they tried to extend DACA. They thought, we got away with that. And they thought, now we're going to extend it to their families, parents of DACA beneficiaries and others. And that was challenged, right? The effort to expand DACA was challenged in court and defeated, right? I mean, they shot down DAPA. DAPA was defeated. And with that, people realized, the same arguments used against DAPA could be used against DACA, right? And it was with the defeat of DAPA that the plaintiffs decided, all right, now we're going to take on DACA because we know we've got winning arguments in court, and we can use those same arguments in court. And that's, the state of the current litigation right now. That's why there's still an outstanding legal challenge to DACA, and that's why the Trump administration felt empowered to try and abolish it by executive order. The other point I want to make about DACA, which is often overlooked, is prior to 2012, there was much less immigration of unaccompanied minors and families at the border. Most of the immigration across the border, the undocumented immigration, was single people coming to the United States to work and send back money. That was understood. After DACA, we had a tremendous influx of unaccompanied minors and families. Right? And why is that? In the government we say no good deed goes unpunished. Right? Anytime you show a way in, people embrace it. And people got the message. And there's, reports all the time of people say, we heard that if you bring a kid with you, you get in. And if you don't get in. And even if that was not legally true, it was in practice true. At the border, it became impossible now that we have the policy. You can't separate from parents from the kids. You have limitations on your ability to hold kids in prison. The Obama administration tried their best to stop this flow because they knew it was bad for them, that the border was getting out of control. You had all these families and unaccompanied minors showing up. People that were already in the United States who didn't bring their kids told their kids, hey, come on in. Now's the time to get in here because the Obama administration's giving out papers. It's not literally true, but they thought it was, and they could overwhelm border security by just bringing a lot of people in. The Obama administration tried to have family detention, to detain the families together without breaking them up. ACLU sued the Obama administration and said, no, you can't do that. You can't detain the kids, even if they're with their families. You can't detain the whole family together. So, that's the situation that the Trump administration inherited. So, all right, so you're constrained by all these court orders, and that's why they tried this crazy family separation thing. Well, we can't detain the kids, so we'll split the kids from the parents, we'll detain the parents. Well, that blew up in their faces, as it should have, but we're still coping with the consequences of DACA. No good deed goes unpunished.
Hello. I have a question for Mr. Ting. It's a two-part question. First part of the question is, do you think a proposed border wall is an adequate solution to the immigration problem in the U.S.?
Do I think what?
The proposed border wall is an adequate solution to the immigration problem in the U.S.
Can I answer that one first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Obviously, the wall is not a solution. There is no single bullet that will allow the government to enforce its immigration laws. But I think it is an essential component of immigration enforcement if we're going to have a limit, and if we're going to try our best to enforce the limit. Again, perception is all important. If people see that the limit is being enforced, it will be observed and respected. If people see that, in fact, anyone who wants to can come in notwithstanding the limit, then we're going to be overwhelmed with numbers. We're not going to be able to enforce it. I think the wall is a component of border security. Some people have said it's a force multiplier. You've got X number of Border Patrol agents. They've got an enormous area to try and patrol. If you don't have a physical barrier up, it makes their job much harder. And indeed, that's what the Border Patrol is saying. That's why the president is always able to get Border Patrol agents to say, they need a fence, they need a wall. So it's not the magic bullet. There is no magic bullet to enforcing immigration laws, but it's an essential component.
And my second part of the question was, you mentioned getting rid of racial disparities within the green card lottery system. I wanted to ask, what other aspects of the immigration system do you think should be revamped to make the immigration system more efficient in this country?
Well, let me just say, I certainly do not deny the existence of white supremacy in the United States. I mean, I think it's in the DNA of the country. I'm surprised when people say, "Oh, where did this white supremacy come from at Charlottesville?" We haven't seen that before. It's always been there, right? It's always been there, so it's there, but we need to deal with it on a practical basis. Solve what you can. And one thing that I think would be so easy is by ending the racial discrimination in the green card lottery. So it's a true lottery. Anyone can apply, and if you win, you win, without regard to nationality, and doing away with the per-country caps. The per-country caps were put in place to restrict the number of Mexicans and Filipinos and Chinese and Indians coming in. That's why they're there. How can you do that in the 21st century? It's astounding, and it's astounding that the so-called advocate community won't go to bat and take on the easy stuff. Take on the easy stuff first. No one's going to oppose you when you say abolish the per-country caps, abolish the racial discrimination in the green card lottery. Who would oppose that? I don't think anyone would, and so I don't understand why the easy stuff isn't being taken on. You can, campaign for the larger stuff years down the road. Good luck with that. But I think the easy stuff ought to be taken care of first.
My question is for Jay. You earlier, kind of jumping back a few questions, you made a very clear distinction between economic immigration and refugees and other forms of immigration, and you seem to be very clearly advocating for free economic immigration and movement. And I was wondering how you see economic immigration factoring in differently into our current immigration framework, whether changes should be made to loosen it, or how you see that change of free economic immigration being factored into the existing system.
What do you mean by how do I see it? Like, what would I like to do, or what do you
yes,
mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I just want to tear it all down. I mean, I feel like we're having a debate about, when the government prohibits alcohol, like, which fish should it punch you with when it prohibits it, and, like, we shouldn't prohibit it at all. It doesn't make sense for it to do it. So basically any reform someone says that means more, or, like, more liberal, more permissive, I'm in favor of. And unless it's, like, completely permissive, then I'm against it. I want to say there are special cases. Like, if you knew that my home, like my neighborhood in Northern Virginia, had a sudden outbreak of, like, I don't know, Ebola, and then people put barriers around, like, we're going to quarantine you because you're all sick. I think that kind of thing can be justified in the short term, like a real, like, we know there's a disaster there, and there might be these kinds of arguments for special kinds of restrictions in special cases. Like, we're not going to let anyone move here from this area right now because there's an outbreak of a deadly disease. There's like special cases like that. But other than that, I just think it's like, look, there doesn't seem to be a principled economic argument for these restrictions. There's no reason to think the government knows what the number is. It doesn't have any special reason to know, like, which people are useful for the economy. The whole 250 years of economics tells us the government does not know that, right? And then even making arguments that are like, well, this is the liberal tradition in the United States, like the tradition of the United States. It's like, that's not true. The whole tradition of the United States is supposed to be that fundamental freedoms don't get overturned by political fiat. They're supposed to be, like, they trump the will of the people. Like, people are free unless we have a really good reason to restrict them, and we don't seem to have it. So I just want to tear it all down, as much of it as I can. So anything that counts as tearing it down, I like. Anything that counts as building it up, I dislike.
You want to abolish the Constitution? That would tear it all down.
I mean, that's for a different day. But I'm not actually sure. Like, I don't remember the part of the Constitution that says anything about immigration. It's not in the Constitution, and there's things in the Constitution that say Congress shall not have powers that go beyond what's enumerated here, and that all gets ignored. So I admit I'm not a legal scholar, but I certainly don't remember there being a part of the Constitution that says anything about immigration restrictions. They just get snuck in anyways. So, yeah, why don't we stick to the Constitution, which doesn't seem to have any provisions for immigration restrictions.
And I would just add to that, as someone who also studies public health, even with something that you think of as so objective as health, right? There are all these ways in which people construct that through a racial frame. So there are epidemics in the early 20th century in which it's construed as coming from Mexico, never coming to the U.S., so people from Mexico are deloused. They take kerosene baths. There are examples in the U.S.-Mexico border in El Paso of an immigration station catching on fire with people in it because they were delousing their clothes with kerosene. People who crossed daily as laborers and had to be deloused every week. And yet, if Americans went into Mexico and crossed back, they didn't have to go through that. So all these things that we think of as, objective, even those are subject to this. I love the example of the people that protested at that time period were women. Why? Because they were crossing on a daily basis because they were housekeepers. So again, it was, immigration from Mexico is dangerous and they're bringing disease. We're also letting them into our house if we need it cleaned. So.
Good evening. I just want to thank St. Olaf for allowing Northfield people to come in and be part of this. Question for Professor Brennan. First, you had an example, that some of the immigrants coming in to take jobs will be substitutes, and others would be complementary. Can you give some examples of what would be a complementary type of?
Yeah. So I don't mow my own lawn. I sometimes shovel, but I generally don't shovel. I don't install siding. I do a lot of outside housework, and it's not because I'm bad at that stuff. I mean, some of it I'm bad at, but a lot of stuff I'm really good at. The reason I don't do it is because I can hire lots of immigrants in my high immigration area to do that kind of stuff for me, and then I can go give talks at other universities where I get paid a lot more money than what it would cost me to pay them. So the fact that there are all these people that are doing a lot of the kind of housework and work around the house that my dad would have done, I don't do that stuff. I hire other people to do it. I go give a talk at a university. I get paid more money. My income goes up, and their income goes up. So that's an example of complementarity. The immigrants we hire at Georgetown, we hire a lot of immigrants as professors. My job is completely open to the world. It doesn't have any restrictions. It's really easy to get a job in the U.S. if you have a PhD. But other people that we're hiring that are sort of helping the faculty do things and specialize in their tasks, that's an example of complementarity. An example of substitution would be something like, imagine you're a relatively uneducated guy doing physical labor, because it usually the research says it mostly affects men, not women. So men with a lower than a high school diploma who are doing a lot of physical labor that doesn't require a high degree of skill. And I agree, a lot of the things we call unskilled labor are actually very skilled. But whatever this unskilled labor thing is, that's the case where you have a lot more people around the world who are able to do that kind of work. And when those sorts of people come into the U.S. or other countries, they tend to, at least in the short term, depress wages. Only in the short term. Even I never say his name properly. Is it Borjas or Borjas? Borjas. Thank you. Even he thinks we're talking about like a 5% drop in income over like a 10-year period, and it'll rise afterward. Like, so even that's like the most negative stuff in the literature. It's worth noting, by the way, the wage stuff, because there's been a couple insinuations here that like, oh, it's just, people who are really rich like Zuckerberg who want more immigration because it's a source of cheap labor. That's not correct. That's not what the economics says. Here's why. Global capital benefits from the current system in the following way. Imagine the following were the case. Only poor people sell strawberries, and only rich people buy them. Got the idea? Now we have a law that says if you're a rich person who wants to buy strawberries, you're free to go anywhere you want in search of strawberries. But if you're a poor person selling strawberries, you're required to stay put. You're not allowed to move around in search of other strawberry buyers. You have to just stay where you are. What would happen to the price of strawberries in the system? Econ majors, would it go up or down? Yeah, down, right? It'd go down, right? It would artificially depress the price of strawberries, and you give a lot of bargaining power to the people who buy strawberries. So you'd benefit them. So the analogy here would be, think about global capital. Right now, like you have people working in the so-called third world, like in Bangladesh, for 60 cents an hour, like doing things where if they worked in the US, they would make, even after adjusting for the cost of living, so doing purchasing price parity adjustments, 20 times that amount. Why don't they move? Well, they can't. They're sitting ducks for exploitation from global capital. It's easy to move money around. It's easy to move capital around. While I'm talking, you can get on your phone and open up a bank account in another country. What's hard to do is move labor to where it's most valued. And so this system actually artificially depresses world wages for the least skilled people. That's what I want to change.
And can I just follow up really quick? And I think the other part of that is that the reason I keep emphasizing this racial frame is that immigrants don't stop being racialized once they immigrate, just because they cross the border legally or illegally. And so even the kind of jobs they get, or where they can live, who will hire them. So the example of strawberries, Los Angeles, late 1800s, early 1900s, Chinese vegetable peddlers, Japanese farmers, all restricted. Didn't matter if they were legal immigrants, didn't matter if they were Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, didn't matter if they were third generation. Could only farm in certain places, couldn't own land if they were not citizens, lease it for more than 3 years. Chinese vegetable peddlers were restricted to certain parts of town. Chinese launderers were restricted to certain parts of town. So all that racialization doesn't end. And that's why it's important to also think about why the laws are the way they are.
I just want to say something about lawn service, which I thought was an interesting example from Jay. Many of us here, not many of us, a few of us here maybe remember the Reagan Depression after President Reagan was elected. There was actually a serious recession. It was labeled the Reagan recession, and a lot of people were unemployed. A lot of law students graduated from law school and couldn't find jobs. And one of the survival techniques that was widely advocated in the early 1980s was, you could mow your neighbor's lawn, right? It sounds funny, but, a mow and a blow for $25 if you're unemployed, that was a way for people to keep their heads above water in the midst of that recession. That would not be possible today, right? Because you'd have to compete with all these hardworking immigrant working, some documented, mostly not, in the lawn services industry. So that opportunity is foreclosed, right, if you're trying to keep your head above water. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says the reason employment is so high in the United States is so many people are having to work 2 jobs. That's why there's so much full employment in the United States. So I think we have to pay attention to the economic reality, which is a lot of people are just hanging on. I agree with the point that Jay was making, that everyone with capital invested in the stock market benefits from having more immigration and a lower cost of labor. And the more money you have invested in the stock market, the more you benefit from having cheap labor available in the United States. But for the half of the population that has no money invested in the stock market, either directly or through pension plans, they get no benefit from lower wages. They just suffer from lower wages. So that's an economic reality that needs to be taken into consideration too.
I think that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you very much. Craig, did you want to say something about the cards again?
Yeah, please fill out your cards.
Thank you for coming. Good night.
Box on the